would you argue that China's, since we speak about China and its non-intervention policy, I might as well ask a question about it. Would you argue that China's non-intervention policy in relation to African countries and in general is changing?
I think it is. I think it is changing, and one of the ways that it is changing is so. Well, I can take it back a bit. So some people would argue that China has always been intervening, and that its intervention, its non-intervention policy is simply, if we look at it from the Western perspective of intervention, or the dominant understanding of intervention as in military action being taken, we might say China hasn't been intervening. And China uses that argument to say, we don't militarily intervene in the internal affairs of other states. We don't force other states to do what they would otherwise not do. But we need to be able to understand China from its own context. What does intervention mean for China? Is passing a statement condemning an action that has happened in Tibet or in Hong Kong seen as intervention by China? Definitely it does. So that's why when the UK passed a statement and said, okay, we're going to give 3 million Hong Kong citizens with the British, I don't know, BNP passport, the right to stay in the US, China saw it as intervention in its internal affairs. So if that is the definition that China has of intervention, is China intervening when it tells South Africa that it should not give Dalai Lama a visa to visit South Africa? Is that intervention in the internal affairs of South Africa? Because granting a visa is a sovereign decision that every state exercises. And when China stops them from doing that, what instruments of power is it using to force other states to do what they would otherwise not do? So it may not militarily intervene in the way that the US would intervene and force other states or impose direct sanctions, but it has many other instruments that it uses to force other states to agree or to take the position that it wants them to take. And that takes a lot of craftsmanship, if I can say, because it's more delicate. It's in a way that people may not necessarily see it as intervention, but are actually walking the path that China wants the world to walk. So one other example that I can give is that Chinese students, there's so many Chinese students who are studying in the US, who are studying in the UK. And there are many Chinese tourists. Biggest, in terms of tourist numbers, China sends so many tourists to other countries. And if China has a dispute with South Korea, for instance, because South Korea is having military drills with the US and China is not pleased with it, and it says, we are going to stop tour groups from China visiting South Korea. Imagine the massive influence that it has, the impact that it has on the tourism economy in South Korea. If it withdraws its tourists, if it withdraws its students from the UK and from the US. Now, that's massive power that China has that it can use to force states to take certain actions that China wants them to take. So, but then if we look at in international relations terms, what intervention is, we may fail to see what China is actually doing as intervention, but it actually is intervention because it's forcing states to take the position that China wants them to take. So we can please go ahead.
So, sorry if I interrupt. Because I really like what you're doing there, because you're basically using, in some sense, China's own way of viewing intervention as your perspective on intervention. And if we use China's own standards, then China is certainly intervening all over the world, right?
Sure.
But sometimes we might get lost in viewing intervention in terms of a hardcore realist type of military intervention with troops and so on. Like a classic U.S. intervention, right? Like a U.S. intervention in Iraq, for instance. And if we judge China by that standard, China is not intervening. So I think that makes a lot of sense, actually. And we also see the same issue in terms of Confucius institutes, and even in Sweden, we have that discussion, and China reacted quite strongly in relation to a Swedish satire show on Swedish television, where they were supposedly humiliating the Chinese nation and so on. Yeah, I don't have to go into that discussion in detail, but yeah, even in Sweden, and then you can imagine in poorer African states that are perhaps very dependent on Chinese economic relations in terms of export or imports, how vulnerable they perhaps can be.
That's true.
So in your work, you studied this, right? You actually studied this in terms of 3 or 4 different case studies, if I remember correctly. Yeah, in terms of your PhD.
I looked at Mali. I looked at South Sudan and Libya, and I think Libya was one of the interesting cases. But of course, South Sudan quite interesting as well, because South Sudanese leaders actually supported China's actions, which are pretty much similar to the US actions, and says what China is doing is not intervention, it's trying to help us to resolve our conflicts. But when the US tried to do the same thing, they say this is intervention. And that brings up, back that whole discussion we had about the concept of perception of threat. But for South Sudanese, because of their relations with China, if China takes a step of forcing leaders to come and sit and try to resolve the conflict, they didn't see it as a threat to their internal affairs. They didn't see it as intervention in their internal affairs. But when the US tried to do the same thing, they said, "Now look, this is intervention in our internal affairs." So it's quite interesting that China has actually been successful in making some leaders, particularly in Africa, because of the vulnerability issues that you talked about earlier on, that are actually forcing them to fight from the Chinese side and defend China's intervention actions in their countries, which is something quite interesting, because it shows the influence that China has.
Yeah, sorry, we have been talking for a very long time, so I would actually like to ask my last question now before we end, because we could talk for hours and days.
Yeah.
Because it's always interesting to talk to you. Yeah, then before we leave and before we end this session, if you have any advice that you would like to give to the Irish students at Malmö University, what would that be?
I'll say international relations theories, if I can use that example, they are alive, and I love watching news, and it helps us. And we're living in a very interesting time. We're living in very interesting times where most of these theories that we learn in the classroom are actually being practiced. Right? Where neoclassical realism, for instance, we can look at relations between China and the US, the role that political leaders like Donald Trump have in influencing the direction of the US and in its relations with China. We can see small powers punching above their weight, and we see all these things happening around us. Coronavirus, for instance, what implications that is have on state relations. We have seen it happening. Donald Trump calling it the China virus. Why does he feel the need to do that? And how can we explain that kind of behavior? How can we explain the behavior? Right now there are protests in Belarus, and the Belarusian president asked for help from Putin. How is that going to evolve? How do we explain the behavior of Putin? And so we're living in very interesting times. Brexit, for instance, why is the UK behaving in the way that it is behaving, right? And what implications does it have? And I think these are all things that are happening so fast in our time, and we have the whole world is actually like a classroom. So we are not short of empirical case studies to look at. So to be honest, I think this is an interesting time to be IR student and an IR scholar, and
Yeah.
and there is a lot more if you you don't need to make much effort to see what's happening.
Yeah. Yo, no, that's really true. And thank you very much for sharing that. And thank you very much for participating and giving your thoughts on IR theory, on neoclassical realism, and also some empirical insights in relation to that theoretical discussion about China and Chinese-Africa relations. And thank you very much for the advice.
Thank you very